So this is Manor Lords, and we're going to talk about realism today. So the first question I have for you guys is, what do you think of when you hear the term realism when it's applied to video games?
I don't think I play that many realistic games. When was the last time I played a game that I thought was like real life? And I have a hard time thinking of one.
Normally when I hear that, it's generally in like marketing, so I tend to roll my eyes. Like whenever someone's like, "Oh, we're striving for realism," and I go, "Oh boy, here we go again." And then I look at the game, and it's like the exact same big empty open world that every other game is making right now, and that's the realistic part. It's like, oh, okay, well, never mind.
It's realistic because it's boring.
Yeah, because nothing's going on. But that is my knee-jerk response.
Yeah, it does tend to be a marketing buzzword. It's kind of like immersion. What does it actually mean? It's kind of hard to pin it down. I think it's kind of interesting, though, because we've kind of talked about, I think, Noah, you mentioned this in our last episode about Skyrim. You mentioned that we commonly say, wouldn't games be better if they were more like real life? And then we launch out in this episode about realism, and everyone's like, I don't like that word. I don't like it.
It's funny how how conflicting that is, huh? I think the main issue is that I just... as cynical and perhaps egotistical as this is, I'm like, oh, well, realism's cool when I do it, but when I don't trust any game studio to do it right.
Maybe it is kind of like you're saying, it's kind of like a marketing corruption of it. You know, it's almost like they say realism and then it doesn't actually tend to translate into better gameplay.
Does that imply there's a fakeism?
A fakeism.
We're really going for fakeism in this game.
So let's try to like kind of define what the difference there, I think, between what we mean, what like a positive kind of a realism and kind of a negative, the stuff that we hate when they say realism. Maybe we can kind of dive into that as we go through these other questions that we've got here. But before we get into that, do you guys have like any initial thoughts about what the difference might be?
Quality is huge. That's kind of vague, but my first thought, I don't trust quote unquote realism in the hands of many studios because I don't think they can pull it off, and I feel like oftentimes that sullies the quote unquote realistic experience. You know, if we're talking visual realistic, for instance, like if we're talking visual realism, well, if it's Naughty Dog doing it, then I go, okay, I'm not worried. They can pull off visual realism because they just can. I don't know. I see Starfield, and I'm like, well, this is technically a realistic style. I mean, we're in space, but it looks bad, so it doesn't. So it's not well done. So it's kind of a hit and a miss sort of thing. So I feel like that just immediately my first thought is, well, how good at being realism is it?
I feel like you can have a lot of different realistic metrics, right? You have like visual realism, right? Like this game, Manor Lords, right? It's a very like it's like an economic simulator. It's got like a lot of like realistic mechanical things, but you know that house just built itself. Where were the people building it, right? I didn't see people building it. That's not realistic, you know. Like like there's different focuses. You know, in Night in the Woods, people behave like real people, but they're animals. You know, animals aren't realistic, but the way they behave is realistic. So like. Is it a visual realism? Is it a mechanical realism? Is it like what are we trying to capture accurately, and what things don't matter as much to the experience? Because like for instance in Night in the Woods, I don't really care that everyone's an animal. I'm not there for the visual style. I don't think it would benefit from having the graphical fidelity of The Last of Us. But The Last of Us I feel like works really well because it's this gritty, grounded, violent, very human story in its own way, and the way that it explores its themes and stuff like that, I feel like it visually benefits from that as well. Not to say The Last of Us couldn't be a good game if they were cat people. I could see that in a certain universe, but it definitely has its own vision. Manor Lords has a subdued and realistic graphic style and is trying to simulate an economy, like I said. But I just feel like there's different metrics that we can measure realism on.
I just want to tack on real quick. I like to think that Nick has like some sort of agenda. Like he's like desperately trying to get more like furry games made, but he doesn't want to. It's like I'm just saying The Last of Us could be made with cat people. I'm just saying. High fidelity, really, really pretty cat people.
So that's actually, I wasn't thinking about visual realism when I made these questions, but now that you guys have brought it up and got me thinking about it, I find that very fascinating. Because because especially like you mentioned the idea of like, you've got Night in the Woods, a game about animal people, versus like The Last of Us, which is a very, very visually realistic, very gritty kind of a thing. And I wonder, because it's interesting, because it's like you said also in Night in the Woods, it's a game where it's about, it's basically like people, it's people's stories and stuff like that. It's nothing that is unique to animals or anything. You could see this being a story that, I think people relate to it because they can see their own feelings and their own experiences in it. I think it's a great game. But now this is really interesting to me. You brought up that difference between Last of Us and Night in the Woods, and I'm thinking like, why are those both respectively the way that they are? Why is Night in the Woods about animals when it's a very human story? And then why is The Last of Us very human looking in addition to like why is it not animal people? And I wonder what the trade-off is there. And perhaps Noah, you're like a really big fan of the Last of Us games.
I'm pretty sure I've talked about it in every podcast episode, so
yeah. So I'm curious about would you like it if it were cat people? The reason I ask is like why does that visual or human normalness matter so much in a game like that to you? Or does it? Gosh. Would you be content if it was like a lizard and a cat and a
fish guy
and a dragon?
Oh man, I might have to think on that a little bit. That's a doozy.
Stew on that, yeah. Because that's something I really don't know. This is something I've been wrestling with lately because I'm just trying to make our own games and trying to figure out, do we make it like really wacky and weird looking, or do we make it like really normal looking? Because, yeah. So that was all kind of like spinning off of our first question of what we think of when we hear the word. But let's talk about my next question here, and we can come back if you come up with anything, Noah, about why you feel that way about that, or if you do have any feelings, we'll come back to that. Have you guys, so tell me this though, like, and Nick, you probably have a lot to say on this, but have you ever felt like a game was trying too hard to be realistic? And can you tell me what that game was and why it didn't work for you?
A whole lot of games that I don't think look really visually interesting, and a lot of the time that means there's a lot of stylization going on. So in the realm of visual realism, if we could start there, because I'm kind of a visual fella. Let's take Starfield, for instance, which I have not played, admittedly, but which primary reason that I haven't played is I just really couldn't. I didn't find the art direction particularly compelling. I know I would have been drawn more to it if I felt like there was more style and a little less focus on trying to be as NASA as possible. NASA's fine if you compare it with something like Outer Worlds, which I enjoyed enough of to play. Again, I didn't stick around mechanically. It wasn't the most engaging to me, but I thought it had a lot of fun style, and that was something that was compelling to me, even though it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit quirky, a little bit weird. So Starfield's an example of something that I think the visual style just kind of off-put me. And again, that's a personal preference. I know a lot of people really like a very grounded sci-fi aesthetic.
I'm kind of surprised you didn't mention Outer Wilds. You mentioned Outer Worlds.
Oh, yeah.
And you have this other space game that you like rave about all the time,
I was trying to
which
pick
is
something
super
in the
wacky
same
looking.
genre.
Oh, okay.
But it's true. Outer Wilds is kind of my favorite game, and it's about a bunch of aliens, and it's incredibly stylized. Like you're walking on a planet, and the textures are very bright and colorful and saturated and flat. The poly count isn't super high. You've got all these four-eyed aliens and space anglerfish and wildly wacky physics systems that it's so interesting, actually, because Outer Wilds is totally simulated. That's something that's crazy about it. So realism in that sense, the entire solar system is behaving like a real solar system would. The planets are actually in orbit.
Yeah.
There's actual gravity. But then there's also wacky things like a black hole in the middle of a planet, or two planets where sand is being passed from one to the other. Or time travel, to say the least of it. But I feel like they marry those elements so well. I just feel like they had an experience they were going for, and they used the realistic elements that contributed to that, and kind of ignored ones that were less interesting.
If I may, I have a thought as well. Just sort of comparison in terms of realism. I feel like commitment has a big part of it too. When you're making a game, you have to decide, like what Nick was saying, what things are you going to be realistic on, and what things are you not going to be realistic on, and to some degree, and to the extent of what is important, that's a question. What am I going to put all the effort into realism here, and what it just simply doesn't matter because, it would damage the game, right? But I think also there's a sort of a dissonance that you can get when the realism doesn't match up in the world, where some things are realistic, but other things that you feel should also be realistic within that world are not. I was recently playing Red Dead Redemption 2, and then I was also recently playing Dying Light 2. And I remember playing through Red Dead 2, and it sold me on its world so well and its realism because they went into everything. You can't just clean your gun in that game. You also can clean your gun, and it also shows the animation for skinning birds. But that's not all. It also shows the animation for every time you eat food out of a can, you throw it on the ground. It also has the animation for when you smoke a cigar, and they don't just put realism into some things and then leave other things completely untouched. And I feel like that's kind of an important part of it too, is like, it's sort of in for a penny, in for a pound. It's like, all right, well, if you're going to make a realistic game, if we're talking visually, if we're talking animation, you know, you got to stick to it. And I remember playing Dying Light 2, this game that takes itself seriously story-wise, and its characters are realistic and stuff. But I remember going up to or the characters are quote-unquote realistic. I don't think the writing in Dying Light 2 is very good. But I remember running up to, it was like a first session, and Nick and I were sitting next to each other, and I run up to this box, and I search it, and my guy, like, he doesn't, like, there's no animation that makes sense, because it's like, oh, there's a pile of garbage, and then he puts out his hands, and he sort of waves them around for a second, like he's casting a spell, and then it's like, oh, you got some bolts, cool. And I was like, and I just remember that, and I was like, what was that? What did I just do? That looked so dumb, and it wasn't realistic at all. It was weird. I was doing my EBGB Goobo magic on that pile of clothes to get whatever. And so, like, I don't think that, and this is a very long-winded way of saying this, but, like, I feel like if a game only puts in the effort for realism on some things that you feel like should also be applied to other things within that game's world and its context, it can be really disjointed and make it feel like it's cheap, like it's made with glue and scraps, and it just doesn't feel real anymore, I think, for me.
So it's got to commit, is what you're saying, to make it really...
Yeah, I think commitment's huge. That was kind of long-winded, but that was what I meant.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about some of the games I like, because I like a lot of realistic ones, actually. It was things that I think of as kind of realistic. In fact, one of my favorite RPGs that I've played was Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is kind of famously devoted to realism, you know, to the extent where it's just like really hard to do a lot of stuff that is really easy to do in other RPGs and stuff like that. It's definitely not anything like your Elder Scrolls fantasy games or even like The Witcher or any other like medieval type thing. It's like, it's very like zoomed in on, you know, this bohemian peasant, basically. And it's a great game. It's also like one of the few RPGs that I've like played all the way through. Like, granted, it took me like 3 starts to get through it because it was really hard and I didn't get it at first. But in that sense, or on that regard, there's it's kind of funny. I've been playing Skyrim recently with my wife, and I turned on the survival mode that they have, because that was the first time I'd ever seen that option before. It's actually like super tedious. A lot of the time, and part of that is that the game is just not built for that. Like, it doesn't let you fast travel, and then you get quests that zip you like from one end of the map to the other one, and I'm like, what, am I supposed to walk like 3 times before I can advance this plot? This is ridiculous. Actually, no, you mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2 as well, and I think that sometimes like I do get a little bit frustrated at how long it takes for me to like pick up everything in that game. So sometimes I feel like adding, because that's something about quote unquote realism that I don't love, is that it adds tedium to your life. And I think it can also depend on the type of game. Like, if it's a survival game, maybe, you know, it makes sense. But I want to be able to like outgrow that initial like challenge of like feeding myself, you know, like I don't want to like struggle with that the entire game unless the game ends as soon as you figure it out.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point in like the survival kind of genre, which is a very realistic in the ways that you have to meet human needs that many, many, many other games ignore. Even I think other realistic ones. In City Skylines, you might be planning an urban city, but you don't have to make sure that you cancel your 5 o'clock to get McDonald's because you're hungry. You know, like I've definitely played tedious survival games.
Gosh, imagine how much City Skylines would suck if every single time you wanted to build something, you had to get like the governor's permission of the state, and it was just like a bureaucratic red tape simulator. It actually takes,
the thing is, that actually sounds like
to
fun to me.
I think you just need the experience to be focused on that thing. Like, I just feel like every game is a decision. Is like the design of every game is a decision of what to include and what not to. Right? Like, if you have everything, it's not. Maybe you could have everything. Maybe if you had all the time in the world and all the resources in the world and all the technology in the world. But most games are focused on providing a specific experience. And I think that for me, I'm much less... The question that I think I'm asking myself when I play a game is it realistic? I don't know. Is it interesting? And if it's interesting is what keeps me in, you know, like even if it's not realistic, like I'm playing Titanfall and I'm like, yeah, man, I'm driving around a freaking giant mecha. This is a great time. Is it realistic? I don't care. It's fun. It's interesting. It's making interesting decisions. But also, like, if your game's about like Crusader Kings, for instance, we chat about that one a lot. You expect it to behave like medieval Europe because it's about politics in medieval Europe. You don't expect to see people eating their meals. You don't expect, if a mecha appeared in Crusader Kings, that'd be really interesting. But it would be kind of jarring and kind of take you out of the experience that it's created. It's created its own, it has its own vision for the game.
Maybe that's what it is that, like, it's not realism. Maybe realism isn't what, gosh, this is one of the most head-scratching podcast topics we've had so far. It's fast, like, I'm having a blast, but this is like it's been in my brain a little bit. But maybe it's like what you're saying, Nick. It's like it's not realism based off of the real world that makes a game feel real, but it's realism based off of what the world has outlined, what the game has outlined as being real, right? Like maybe that's
kind of like an internal consistency.
Yeah.
So you were talking about commitment a few minutes ago.
And also realism based off of, like, what matters in the game. Like, Death Stranding, I have such a love-hate relationship with that game, but I actually really adore the game, the moment-to-moment gameplay of walking, and you have to, like, balance yourself and stuff and, like, actually chart out where you're going to walk, which is very real if you've ever walked anywhere. You know, you have to think. And if you've ever hiked in nature, like, you have to think. But imagine if that was a mechanic in, I don't know, like Titanfall. Imagine if every time you hopped into your mech, it was like, oops, I was off balance, and then your mech falls over and you have to pick it back. Like, that would suck. That would be realistic, but that's not what the game's about. And so, like, so then that would be tedium. That would be tedious.
I feel like it's such a game of focus. Like, what is your game's focus? And when you focus on something, you necessarily have to leave other things to the side.
And you probably have to leave certain audience beside as well.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. I think that people who play hyper realistic mil sims that are about, like, they aren't going to enjoy Titanfall as much, probably. If your thing is, I want this to feel like I'm in the trenches of, Normandy, the trenches of Normandy. You can tell I play super realistic. And the furry trenches of Normandy.
The beach trenches.
That's the game I'm gonna make. It's gonna be a hyper realistic mil sim where you're trench fighting in Normandy and everyone's a cat.
Everyone's a cat.
And they're using their little, like, plastic sand shovels to, like, dig these trenches.
Yeah.
You watch the scene from Saving Private Ryan. They're, like, desperately trying to throw the sand up to build little sandcastle fortifications.
He's got a little bucket that's shaped like a castle. He's, like, putting them down as quickly as possible off the wall.
And his arm gets blown off, and he's like, ah.
What's funny, though, is that was committed to, it could be really entertaining.
It could be. It could make a lot of people mad.
That's okay. So do you guys find that a game... So here's an interesting thing. I tend to find games sometimes less interesting. Media, fiction, a lot of stuff less interesting. Not entirely true, but often I find things less interesting if they go too fantastic or too wacky. Mm-hmm. So, like, I know this is not typical at all, but for many people, like, it's like, oh, it's like the fantasy, the dragons, the massive explosions, like the big, grand, wacky, different, otherworldly sense of things. I'm not just talking about spectacle, just like differenceness.
Sure, yeah.
Like differenceness.
Differenceness, yeah.
Difference. The difference.
We can title that the video. Realism and differenceness.
But I just find that to be, I wonder if that's just like a player-to-player, audience-to-audience kind of a thing where it's like, for me, I'm like less interested in something if it has cat people, Like the fact that Skyrim or the Elder Scrolls games have a lot of different species that you can play as, it is not a selling point for me at all. In fact, I ignore that. I don't play as the cats or the lizards. And I find myself grateful that most of the people I talk to are people like, at least, And then I'm drawn to games like, Crusader Kings, which is about people. I'm drawn to, Kingdom Come Deliverance. There's a lot of medieval stuff, but it's not just the medieval stuff. Like, one of my favorite movies is Master and Commander, a very gritty, very grounded, very a very dad movie.
Yeah, that is 100% the, oh, this is on TV, and like your dad walks in and then he stands there with his arms folded, like, oh wait, like
for 2 hours.
For 2 hours, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite movies, and those are a lot of my favorite games, and so I find that to be, I mean, Game of Thrones, I enjoy the books and the show fairly well, but I also don't really see the necessity of having ice zombies and dragons. I'm like, I just want to like just do the people part, man. Like that's what I'm into. And so like I find that it actually kind of like sometimes negatively impacts my interest in something when it's not somewhat normal, And so I wonder, I'm not sure what I wonder. I just wonder about the differences, I guess, between each of us in like, what do you, does that draw you in, or is there a particular kind of fantasy that actually works for me? Because apparently there is. I like The Witcher, I like The Lord of the Rings, I like Game of Thrones, and those are all very fantastic stories,
I'd be curious to know what about those fantastic stories compels you, and whether like the Balrog existing in Lord of the Rings is a turnoff for you.
Yeah, see, that's a great example. The Balrog's awesome. Like the Lord of the Rings, I think, is one of the best. It handles fantasy the best out of anything I've ever seen. Like I actually am grateful for the fantastic elements in the Lord of the Rings, whereas in Game of Thrones, what a lot of people think of as kind of a counterpart, a more realistic counterpart, a more gritty kind of counterpart. I find that the fantasy stuff, it doesn't, I don't care about it. I don't care for it as much.
Yeah.
But it seems so integral and necessary to the Lord of the Rings. I mean,
it does.
That's really interesting to me, because like I've been thinking about this, like the idea of like, what place does all this quirky, crazy stuff have in a story?
I was just saying, we've been talking about this. We were just talking about this like an hour ago.
I kid you not. Yeah, this is on my mind all the time.
All the time.
I feel like so much of it is what, the story is about. I think the Lord of the Rings is mythical. And I'm not going to try to break down I'm not going to try to justify why dragons need to exist in it, right? That is such a big conversation. But I feel like you said, it just feels right. Like it feels integral to the story. Lord of the Rings isn't Lord of the Rings if it's not this legendary struggle of good and evil with forces of incredible power and all these sorts of things. I've been thinking a lot about Arcane, the League of Legends TV show, which I was watching with somebody recently, and they commented there's a bit a few episodes in the second episode where they're talking about magic, and there's like a furry guy, and like in the first episode you just don't like, there's like fish people in the background, there's other things, but you kind of just like, oh yeah, this is a story about people, and oh yeah, magic. You like there's, that's right, I forgot this is a fantasy world, right? But also the magic to that story, especially as it goes on, is so integral. Like I feel like there's a reason it's called Arcane without getting into spoilers. I feel like the entire story is about everybody grappling with magic in some way or another, grappling with the technology surrounding it, the sociological implications, like what it does to their society. And so Arcane without magic, like what would that even be?
Yeah.
What would Lord of the Rings be if there wasn't Sauron and demons and dragons? There's not much left. Whereas Game of Thrones is still a compelling political drama, even without the dragons and White Walkers, I think.
Yeah, I not to sound like a broken record, but I really think that's the commitment part of it too. Is like, and it's funny, Zach, that you mentioned Game of Thrones, because I recently rewatched it and I had the same thought. I was like, you know what, this doesn't feel like it's the same story. Like we're for one scene we're in King's Landing and we're dealing with the approaching armies of Stannis Baratheon, and they're trying to figure out how the heck they're gonna solve it. And then we jump to the Wall, and there's like Jon Snow and White Walkers, and I'm like, these don't feel like they're connected. I feel like had it set up its world in such a way where like all of it was centered around like, magic and stuff, that would have worked better. But which is like what you were saying with Arcane, where it's like the entire plot is all pushed on by everyone reacting to the magic, and so the magic feels like it's necessary. But with Game of Thrones, it feels like the politics are necessary, and the magic is it's just over there. It's just on the fringe of the story, and it's not impacting everyone through the story, and it only shows up later. So it feels like it's kind of shoehorned in a way.
Wow. Yeah. I feel exactly the same way. I'm also realizing how totally controversial that is to fans of Game of Thrones, But I completely agree. Yeah. Like I was trying to watch it a second time a couple of years ago, and I was like, I don't care about the zombies. I just want to go back to the politics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just take me back to, you know, because I don't know. Yeah, that's very interesting. But yeah, no, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, a lot of stuff like is like, oh yeah, no, like, yeah, you need the magic, you know, or the fantasy stuff to make it feel like it makes any sense, you know, like it's necessary.
You know, for all that we complain about Dungeons and Dragons here, and how much we feel like the world is kind of weird and not really huge fans of it, like, it is very difficult to like, that is a, you know, a necessarily wacky thing. Like, basically every character in the game has the wacky built into them to some degree. And, like, there's magic everywhere, there's weird items everywhere, there's weird creatures everywhere, like, and it might not be the most like mechanically consistent thing, but you can expect things to be weird because it just kind of feels like that's kind of the whole point of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of like where Dungeons and Dragons came from, like originally there was like wargaming, like historical wargaming, right? Mm-hmm. Like you'd play like, and then someone just, I can't remember exactly what it was. It wasn't Gygax. It was one of the guys that he worked with, but he's like, he just has his wargaming group, and then people show up one night and he's got like, hey, we're going to do a fantasy one this time. And they're like, okay. And then the rest kind of just spiraled out of that. But like, yeah, it was like a different niche entirely. Like Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of tabletop RPGs are based on, well, they're all based on Dungeons and Dragons. And so, and Dungeons and Dragons is based on being a fantasy setting. Anyway, and there was a bunch of like historical stuff that people were trying to get away from by doing the fantasy Dungeons and Dragons. And that became way more popular and successful than the old wargaming stuff.
I mean, shoot, it's the name, Dungeons and Dragons. It's not called politics and gerrymandering. Oh. Like it's it sounds like a great game to me, but
yeah,
but that's not what it is.
I feel like we're not going to get to the bottom of this right now. Like we're almost done with this episode. Yeah. And yeah, we're gonna need more time
to part 2.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Zach, and you don't have to answer this now, but if you want to answer this at a later time, what is it about like the fantasy characters that you find, you know, turns you off to them being compelling? And or in what situation, like, and why do some, for you specifically, why do some not, like, why is it that The Witcher's okay, even though it has some of that as well, but Skyrim's not? You know, that you avoid the lizard people in Skyrim, but you know, I'm just curious about your own perspective on that. I just wonder that. So
I actually kind of have a gut reaction to that. I can give it to you right now, if you guys are good on time.
Lay it on me.
Yeah,
cool. So my gut reaction is kind of like, a lot of the time it's like, why are you purple? You know, like, why couldn't you be a normal person? And I think that is that's kind of my gut reaction when I see something that's fantastic in a game and it doesn't quite feel right, you know, or a movie or whatever. Because I just find reality to be quite interesting, you know, like I'm actually really interested in history. I'm quite interested in people. I'm quite interested in politics and psychology and, you know, yeah, that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, you know, there's an interesting story here that is happening without the fantasy part, you know. And this is not true of everything that has fantasy in it, right? Like, I'm just talking about when I do have a problem with it, this is the reaction I'm having. I feel like layering on something that is unsubtle and unrealistic, it almost like it puts a buffer between me and the subtlety. Like, it's almost like, it's like, okay, well, we're not going to get into like the more nuanced parts of this character. We're not going to get like deep into the subtlety of what's going on here, because we've zoomed out and now we're looking at, you know, a less subtle, less nuanced, more blunt, more direct kind of like way of looking at the world. Does that make some kind of sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So is it, I suppose, bright purple color that is the less subtle way of looking at the world?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like when you're, so like, to be more specific, I'm sorry. So I'm like talking to two different characters in a video game, or talking to a character in a video game. If they're a lizard person, I'm like, well, that's not very subtle. That's not very, you know, why couldn't I just be talking to a regular person, right? Like, and if it was a regular person, I feel like, okay, well, I might get a chance to like kind of extract a little bit, might be more thought-provoking to me to like sift through what they are as a person, like as a human, you know, get more into like what they are as like, as an individual kind of like thing. But if they're a lizard or if they're a dragon or something, then it's like, okay, like I'm not going to be able to get deep into you like that. You know, like I'm not going to be able to get the nuance or the subtlety of this character, because there's something really glaring and obvious about them that isn't subtle, you know, and that's like kind of a defining thing. And I don't think that's wrong, because you have fantasy and stuff like that, which is I mean, Lord of the Rings is decidedly unsubtle, and I think that's kind of like what Martin was trying to do when he wrote Game of Thrones, was do something like a similar thing, but more, nuanced and gray, But I also like Lord of the Rings more than I like Game of Thrones, So, so it's not a universal rule here. It's just that I think sometimes I think it's just a trade-off there. And if you start going fantasy, I feel like a lot, or fantastic or wacky or something, you start to like move more to the realm of myth and legend and grandness and that kind of thing. Whereas if it's like, I've been watching a lot of Kurosawa and Tarkovsky and stuff like that lately, like, foreign film directors, those are very different directors. It's a Russian and a Japanese man, but they're very like character, like human, like centric, zoomed in. A lot of them are, not all of them, but a lot of them are really zoomed in and just like, and Tarkovsky does a lot of sci-fi, so I don't know. I mean, but it would be weird if there was like, I'm watching Ikaru, about this guy who discovers he has stomach cancer, and then like, and then there's lizard people in it, like that would be very strange to me, Yeah.
I have this suspicion that's been planted in my head by a YouTube video that I watched recently, and if I can remember it, I might ask that we include it in the description. But it was exploring the idea that like a lot of fantastic stuff, it's still an exploration of the human experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just, instead of being a story where every character is the human experience, the story is the human experience. Like something like Lord of the Rings, with its kind of mythological scale, isn't about like the orcs are representative, right? I wouldn't go so far as to say what they are representative of, but I think it's safe to say that much of the Lord of the Rings is symbolic, and that you're meant to interpret it, and you're meant to kind of look at it and go, what could this mean? What could this represent? Instead of being literal, instead of being, this is a human, this is the experience they're having. It presents a mythic, symbolic, kind of abstract story, and kind of almost, we'll throw a link to it if we can. I just think that, like, yeah, you're right, lizard people are out of place in Ikaru, but if you were to take the story of Ikaru and try to, and I don't know, the themes are, I think, if I understand, are like a man dying, right, and like him dealing with that trying to figure out
trying to find some meaning in his life. Yeah.
Now, I feel like if you expanded that same idea and put it about a fantasy world that was dying and a bunch of crazy, fantastical things trying to cope with the end of the world, you could explore those same themes, but in a mythological and symbolic way, where giant goat monsters and furry cat people defending the trenches of Normandy, have some kind of value beyond themselves, right? They're not meant to be a literal representation of a literal person. It's not meant to be a picture of reality. It's meant to be a story that encompasses thematically some ideas of the human experience.
So you have like really the Ents.
Yeah.
You have like the Ents of Middle Earth, where it's like they've lost their women, their wives, right? And they like left. Like the women got fed up with them and left. And that's like the whole that's about loss, that's about uncertainty and like perhaps a certain hopelessness, or even like hope, I guess. It kind of depends on how you interpret it. But it's kind of like what you're saying there. It's like a representation of those things in the form of these tree people, which is really moving to read. We've been reading the books, and the way that they talk about it is like, oh man, that's so resonant, spiritually, I suppose. I suppose we're out of time. We have to get right to this up. But like, this has been a very fascinating conversation. I'll be listening to this recording again and thinking about it in the future. Yeah. And
certainly,
if any of our 2 viewers have any input on this, like, please, throw your ideas down there in the chatting thing, and we'll look at it, because maybe you have the answer that we're looking for. All right, guys. Well, thanks for chatting. We'll do this again soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Bye.